So just to introduce this, we've had a number of bits of work through, well, a couple of different working groups on the topic of transparency, one in particular, and some feedback from government. So we want to provide an update on that, but also not only what we're doing locally, but with some of the bits and pieces that are happening globally that we'd love to update you all on. So Sarah, I was going to put up a slide with Mork and Mindy. Does anyone remember Mork and Mindy? I'm not looking at Sarah because she didn't let me put it up. But this is an internal thing. It's just me being silly. So Mindy was sort of really sensible, not sensible, but reliable and eloquent. And Mork's just a random alien. I've been trying to, since we end up doing quite a lot together, I just thought, we've got to rebrand our double act as something else. But anyway, I don't think Mork and Mindy's, I think that's not been approved by the board. Anyway, Sarah, I'll let you start.
Thank you, JJ. Last year at this event, we heard from Morag Bond from the ACCC's Digital Platforms branch about the ACCC's work looking into competition in the advertising services markets and the role that the ACCC saw industry playing in developing standards to increase transparency in ad tech and throughout the supply chain. So, and we also heard at the last event from the AANA and the MFA as well around their perspectives of the importance of transparency and how they thought that should be achieved as well. So JJ and I thought, it'd be great to put together an update today just to follow up on that and let people know where things are at and what are the next steps likely to be for industry on that as well. Brilliant, it worked. For background, for those that are new or weren't here last year, the previous government asked our competition regulator, the ACCC, to consider the impact of digital platforms on the media and advertising services markets. And the ACCC has undertaken a number of inquiries in response to that. The key one really of interest to the IAB is the Digital Advertising Services Inquiry, which reported in September 2021 and made a number of recommendations, including that industry should develop an agreed approach to publication of fees and take rates for ad tech services, as well as independent verification of demand-side platform services as well, and that industry should progress work on how to achieve transparency in the ad tech supply chain more broadly. So IAB met with the ACCC and, as JJ said, started the process of talking to members and the industry really to consider, firstly, how we could go about progressing the ACCC's recommendations, and secondly, looking at what are the key technical options available for progressing end-to-end transparency in the supply chain. What's happened since and where are we at now? In short, on the government side of things, there isn't really any significant update to provide. So industry-led transparency was only one aspect of the ACCC's inquiries, and while that was an important aspect, the government is clearly working on a whole range of issues that the ACCC raised and how they kind of all fit together. We should, though, have an indication from government, probably in the next few months or so, on how they're thinking, which will then give us a steer on timeframes and also what the government's expectations of industry will be going forward. Overall, as an industry, we are, though, now, having gone through that process last year, much more prepared to engage with government on this when it does become their focus. And while there are still some issues to iron out and talk to the ACCC further about, we've identified effectively how key elements of the standard on fees and take rates and DSP verification could be framed. And we've also, might actually jump to the next one. We've also explored some of the options for transparency across the supply chain more broadly. They're summarised on the slide. I won't go into them in detail, but essentially we talked through the benefits and risks of key options, including a transaction ID, a manual financial audit similar to the UK ISPA style audit, and a DLT or blockchain solution, and considered what would be required for these options to be implemented. And on that note, I might pass to JJ to talk more about what we're doing to progress some of that work and what we already have in place.
Yes, I'm coming at you for the clicker, sorry. We also had a couple of questions that came up in the working group that we haven't had a response to from Attorney General Department, right? Just as an addition. I think we had some points of clarification for their requests.
We'll talk to them at some point when they're focused on it. So it really hasn't come up yet. So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we did run. Actually, now I feel I'm doing this the wrong way round. I'm going to come back to Sarah's question of me in terms of what's happening locally and particularly globally in and around the transparency piece. But as a part of this, we wanted to run a survey to local vendors, buyers, sellers, in and around a lot of standards. And I actually really like the feedback. I've actually started with more constructive stuff, because actually that's where I quite like the feedback when it's a little bit critical, and I think we can learn from that. And I think that's actually quite important. But overall, I'm actually pretty happy with it, and I like the advice, and I want to share this back with Tech Lab and maybe a couple of our councils and working groups on it. I found it interesting. I mean, it's very likely that the support for sort of authorised sellers and the foundational standard that we're building upon is always going to be fairly positive, and the adoption's very high. Still a little bit of grey areas I found actually in terms of awareness from some parts of the industry, which is also quite interesting, something to work on there. I feel like we do need to actually show some of this in action, and I fantasized about this for a while, but I think that's something we need to try and do almost live at a future event, maybe even the Melbourne one, which feels like it's jam-packed already. Sellers.json, so the next layer up in terms of the transparent paths, feeding from publishers, declaring their sellers to the platforms that can do that selling, as it were, and the link between the two, which is readable by machines and humans. So pretty good, some awareness. The feedback I thought was really useful, and we'll publish this with some additional guidance, which also links in, I think, to Keaton's points he made on his panel. Supply chain objects a little less so. So I think this is something I'd love to work on demonstrating with a DSP and a buyer that's open to it, and other partners to actually see it in action and see what you can pull out in the reporting, and ways of ultimately automating that across the industry, I think, would be great. But this still feels like work to be done here, even though it's been around for a while. I know it's in use, and some of the feedback was good, but a bit of work to be done there. But I like to see that, and also some aspects of open measurement, which are great, and I'm seeing more and more of that being utilised. Actually, here in Australia, I think we've got 5 or 6 of the major apps now with this SDK in. So I do need to do some work on what's next on the roadmap. I know it's device specific, so incorporating Roku. So there is web for video, CTV is included, but slightly limited. Then it's going to be device specific. The next set of rollouts, as I understand it, Roku, particularly popular in the US, Samsung, I think, and others. So watch out for that. That's something that we can update you on. But in terms of what how the standards have been utilised and the feedback on it in the industry, I really enjoyed that. So we're going to try and utilise that a little bit more and build out on that, and it helps to inform the next areas of work, but also where we still need to do some work. Importantly, I've actually got these slides the wrong way around, because this is a bit of a timeline of the sort of global investigations that have been publicised, mainly because they've been well funded, to be honest. Going right back to the WFA, I think, is one thing, but it felt like it really kicked off with the ANA study in 2017 in terms of awareness, and if I remember correctly, it was a big brand banging the drum at a major event. Was it Cannes? I can't remember. I've got Cannes on the brain. But then I think the work in the UK with ISBA, PwC, where there was a real dig in terms of the requirements, get consistent on log data, just allow that to be regularly accessible contractually, and those discussions should be had up front rather than retrospectively. And I remember those, used to have them all the time. And there is a report out now. It actually came overnight. I think it was presented kind of yesterday in France. And that's another ANA report that's a lot fuller in terms of its approach. But I think there have been some, to be honest, fairly traditional issues in and around it. So they produced a first look report that I could access yesterday. So take a look at it, because I'm assuming, and I haven't looked today, I must admit, that the fuller report will be available and you can dig in. Now, the guidance there is, on one hand, slightly boring, because honestly, we put out a press release 4 years ago, and we put information in our collaborative guidance we did with the other industry bodies that we call the AdOps around this. We made a call out for a lot of these points a number of years ago. There's actually not much new here, but there are a couple of bits that are interesting, I think, in terms of the made for advertising. So that's been included. I think that's timely. That's kind of interesting. Sustainability efforts, that is obviously timely, and they've woven that in. But the devil's going to be in the detail, and it'll be interesting to see what we can see. But there is a positivity there, that whole log level access, contractually and technically. And I know there are a few vendors that actually now provide that as standard. I think because they went through some pain in producing it for these major reports, they just decided to build it into their features, and that's great. So that is a massive positive. So I just thought I'd provide that that highlight in terms of what's happening with those bigger kind of global studies. And as mentioned, have a look at the latest one out of the US and see what that looks like. As mentioned by Sarah, in terms of the approach, the transaction ID concept, which was sort of brought up by the ACCC in one, and then they went a little colder on it, and we do have members that aren't necessarily supportive of it for privacy concerns. But in something like this, and we discussed this in the working group, that we should still try and pilot and test it somehow to be able to see and pull out what those concerns are in terms of what's being exposed and what's at risk. So we have vendors on both the sell side and the buy side that are doing this. Pretty obvious who the sell side vendor is, because they're here on the community extension. So in the GitHub repository, OpenRTB section within IB Tech Lab, we have what are known as community extensions that can be proposed, and they're fed back. And I think these were looked at and reviewed, and there were some tweaks, but ultimately approved. So that's happening, I think, with certainly index exchange, obviously, but that's something I'd love to do some testing and locally, just to look at, so we can have that discussion and figure it out whilst there are concerns, and just see if those concerns can be mitigated or if it helps with a different approach. And then importantly, last year Google had a feature rollout in Google Ad Manager. I still think DFP, and I know everything's renamed. Anyway, sorry, Google. It's GAM, I think, Google Ad Manager. So this is a feature that were released within sort of their stack. They were public about it, and it was discussed in our working group, which was great. But at the time, it wasn't necessarily usable by everyone, and it wasn't something that could then allow for a automated approach to digging into the delta if there was a delta. But at least there was some clarity within that environment. But now, very recently, there's been an update to say that Google, or these features have been opened up. There'll be a commitment to enabling other vendors and this being tested within an open environment, which I think is an important update. So having this approach, which is a very simple, sensible approach, is a start onto a solution that could be applicable for everyone. It is something that should definitely be tested, and I'd love to do some, at worst, regional, at best, local, active testing of this as a working group here in Australia. So have a look at that. I think that's an important step in the right direction. So these are the sort of points that we just wanted to finish with. I just thought I'd provide those updates. So you've heard from Sarah in terms of the government response and what that's starting to look like. And obviously, we'll provide that to you through an article from Sarah/Mindy at some stage. Meanwhile, Mork will continue nanu to work on some of the implementations of what I've talked about there, the global bits and pieces, see what we're finding elsewhere, try and drive some effort, certainly in terms of adoption locally, not only of the standard, but some of the approach for sort of further transparency standards. And we, it's been maybe it's a bit of a fantasy, because in Australia, once you get a number of parties in a room, you can move pretty quickly. And there's been times when we've talked to working groups in the States where there's literally like 200 of them. And they're like, oh, can you guys figure it out? Because there's like 15 members and it's pretty representative. And I still feel like that's something that we could work on here quicker than elsewhere. But anyway. And then just, the consistent access to log level data, both contractually and technically or practically, I think is a great thumbs up. So I don't know if you have any questions on any of that particularly. You can always pump them through in Slido, or you can hit Sarah and myself up at the networking drinks. Jen's got a question. No, that's the handbook. Is that still the handbook? Oh, that is the handbook. So we actually need a new Slido. I've got it. I'm just waiting for you to Oh, right. Okay. Jen, you're up. Okay, right. So ignore this one. Go and have something to eat and drink. Have some fun. Oh, there's a question. Brinkworth, inevitably. Oh, yeah, totally forgot. Sorry, Data Council. So on the point of transparency, let's go back. Ready? Right, let's do that one again. Where do I put it? Maybe around here. No, Chris is one of the 2 co-chairs in our Data Council. Quite rightly, we did swap notes earlier this morning. I've totally forgot. I'm very sorry. That we put out a data collaboration platform explainer, which has a lot of interesting topics in it. But in there is a reminder around the data transparency standards that the industry is committing to increasingly. You've got data label in there, which is starting to have some real traction. And we're actually starting to see Australian publisher audience segments being loaded into the database, which are publicly viewable. And that's something that we will be pushing more and more over time. But please have a look at the handbook. There are some important points in there.